Hello everybody, I hope you're doing really well. This lesson is to help you with your understanding of the extract from the Prelude by William Wordsworth and should also enable you to complete your annotations. So please make sure you have a copy of the poem to hand, a pen, and if you've got one, a highlighter would also be useful. Take a look at the words which you have in front of you and make inferences on what you think both of these poems will be about, and also what words made you think this. Pause the video to give yourself time to jot down some ideas and then press play when you feel ready. Now, actually, these words are all from the extract from the Prelude by William Wordsworth. So considering that, what do you now think the poem will be about? Again, pause the video to give yourself time to jot down your ideas and then press play when you're ready. Now let's bullet point some information about William Wordsworth. Now he was born in 1770 in the Lake District. Unfortunately, he had a very sad childhood. He didn't get on well with his father at all, and actually both his parents had died by the time he was in his early teens. Sadly, he was separated from his siblings and he was sent to live with relatives who he absolutely detested. And this is what drove him to be out of doors most of the time. And this is really where his relationship with nature began. He was a romantic poet, and you'll find that much of his poetry explores mankind's relationship with nature. Right, everyone, now it's time to read through the poem. So remember, this is an extract from the Prelude. The Prelude itself is 400 pages long, so you only have a proportion of it to read. It's also important to remember that William Wordsworth was a romantic poet, so even though this poem is going to strike you as quite long, the language that you'll find in it is quite straightforward and easy to understand. Pause the video to give yourself time to read through, and then when you feel ready, press play and we'll go through the literal meaning. So we're going to break the poem into 3 sections to look at the literal meaning. So the first section here, which is highlighted in yellow, is describing him heading out on a summer's evening and coming across a boat at the lake, and he takes the boat out onto the lake and he is inspired by, awestruck by the beauty of nature. And now moving on to the next section highlighted in green, this is where we find our turning point in the poem. So the poet reveals he's had a bit of a shock. He reveals this huge cliff which is beyond what he thought was the end point, and it creates such fear and panic in him that he turns the boat around and rows it back to the shore. And in this final section highlighted in blue, this is the poet reflecting on his experience of nature and shows to us that actually how that experience has affected him and how it continues to haunt him. Now let's make some points about the structure of the poem. It is a first-person account, so we're hearing from William Wordsworth about an experience that he himself had with nature in his childhood. It's in the form of a dramatic monologue, so his is the only voice we're going to hear, the same as we did in My Last Duchess and London. So the poem is one long blank verse, so it has no rhyme scheme. What I want you to do is pause the video in a moment and have a think about how you can use the fact that it is a long poem and connect that to Wordsworth's experience. Perhaps have a think back to when you first saw the length of the poem yourself and when you were reading it through. How did that feel to you? So pause the video to give yourself time to gather some thoughts and then press play again when you're ready. So perhaps when you looked at the poem the first time, you felt a bit overwhelmed by its length, and you can connect this idea through to how the poet felt overwhelmed by this experience that he had with nature. So it helps create a sense of empathy for what the poet went through and the impact that it had on his life. Now the poem is written mostly in iambic pentameter, So remember, that's where you have your lines of 10 syllables with alternating stressed and unstressed syllables. There are, however, occasional breaks on this, so you could use that to reflect on when the poet is overwhelmed by his experience, and also that fact that nature cannot be tamed. Now let's make a note of how enjambment is used in this poem. So remember, enjambment is the continuation of a sentence without a pause beyond the end of a line, a couplet or a stanza. So here we could reflect on how enjambment has been used in this poem to add to the sense of the powerful effect that this experience with nature has had on this child. It's like he has to blurt it all out. It's like he hasn't got much power of control over expressing the story of what's happened to him. So some major themes to note down. Firstly, mankind does not have control over nature. Nature has power over mankind. Secondly, nature is described as powerful and terrifying, and through our experiences with nature, we're reminded of our lack of importance. And thirdly, man's society is condemned as prideful and arrogant. So if we think back to the beginning of the poem, remember we have this young boy who's stealing a boat, full of pride, full of arrogance, full of feeling he can do what he likes, and striking out onto that lake, full of that confidence that he knows what he's doing, he knows what to expect, and then suddenly being reminded of his own place in the universe, and actually that he is quite insignificant when compared to the power of nature. Now let's start to take a look at some of the language that Wordsworth has used. So on line 1 we have led by her. Who do you think the her is that Wordsworth is referring to? If you need to pause the video, go ahead and do so, and then press play again when you feel ready. Yes, this is Wordsworth personifying nature herself, and he's saying that he's been led by nature, and led means to guide gently. So he's showing us here that actually he has gone out on this lovely summer evening, but he's not actually intended to turn up where he is. He's been kindly and gently led there, guided there by nature herself. Now let's take a look at the use of straight, I unloosed her chain, and stealth. So particularly thinking about the word stealth and its connotations, I'd like you to pause the video, give yourself time to gather some thoughts, and then press play again when you feel ready. So stealth has connotations of being sneaky, being sly, but also being proud of what you've done as well. So here this language is showing us that he's proud that straight away he stole this boat, and he stole it with that arrogance where he wasn't thinking about any consequences for his actions at all. And then interestingly on the next line we have this oxymoron, troubled pleasure. So a sense here of foreboding creeping in, and perhaps suggesting that the narrator does feel some sense of guilt for his actions. We have Wordsworth using beautiful light imagery to present nature as something completely awe-inspiring and magical. And then we have proud of his skill, chosen, unswerving line, eye fixed, all combining to show us that his younger self felt completely in control in the face of nature. Now this utmost boundary that the poet speaks of is where he felt the cliff ended, but clearly he didn't know everything about everything. There was much more to the world than it seemed. So you can link this idea clearly through to man's insignificance when compared to that, the power of nature. Here we have Wordsworth using elfin pinnace to describe his rowing boat. So a pinnace is a light sailing boat, and it's being described as elfin, so it's giving it that magical quality, which adds to the poet's exaggeration of the experience that he's having. And here we have our turning point in our poem, our Volta. So you'll notice that from this point onwards, the poet uses dark imagery to describe nature. Everything before this point has been light imagery describing nature as beautiful and kind, but from this point onwards you'll see that it takes on a much darker tone. We can see that the poet is becoming overwhelmed by his experience of nature. He's deliberately used repetition with the adjective huge, and this shows us that actually he's at a loss for words to describe this experience that he's having. We also have use of the word black, and I'd like you to pause the video and think about the connotations of that word and then jot down your ideas. You may well have already noticed that from the turning point in the poem, nature is no longer personified, and I've highlighted a few examples of that for you in purple. So you can use this idea of nature no longer being described with this technique as the poet actually losing his power, his vocabulary to describe nature. And now let's take a look at the repetition of struck and think about what that shows us about what the poet is experiencing at this point in time. If you need to, pause the video to give yourself time to gather some thoughts and then press play again when you're ready. So the repetition of this violent language shows us that the poet is feeling a sense of panic and a sense of fear, and we can link that idea through to man's battle with nature. Look at For So It Seemed. So really we need to remember that the poet wrote this as an adult but reflecting on a boyhood experience. So he's saying to us, this is what it seemed like to me as at the time as when I was a child, this is what it felt like to me. And then we have alliteration with measured motion, and we also have the powerful verb strode, and both of these combined show us that actually at this point for the boy he feels that nature has all the power and control. And then we have use of the simile like a living thing. So this is where I think it takes on that almost nightmarish quality. So imagine having a nightmare when you're desperately trying to get away from something, but the faster you're running, the closer it seems to be getting to you. Now let's take a look at the use of the verb stole. So here I think we can feel a sense of desperation and fear on behalf of the boy. It helps us to connect, I think, and feel a sense of empathy for the experience that he's having. He's trying to make his way back to the shore as quietly, as quickly, and to be almost unnoticed in that movement. And then further down, we have the use of dark colour imagery with their hung a darkness. And I'd like you to pause the video and consider the use of the verb hung and its connotations. Yes, it has very much has connotations of not being able to get rid of something. So this shows us that the experience that he had is something which continued to haunt him in the future. And then furthermore, we have use of repetition with the word no. So we have no familiar shapes, no pleasant images, no colours. And we can interpret this as nature having lost all of its beauty for the poet. He now connects the idea of nature with it being a source of pain. And the highly negative tone continues right to the end of our poem with the last phrase, trouble to my dreams, which really shows to us that the poet has continued to feel very unsettled and confused by this experience. Well, everyone, I hope that's helped with your understanding of the poem and enabled you to make some good annotations. If in the future you're asked to compare this poem regarding the power of nature, you'll find it compares really well with Storm on the Island, Exposure and Ozymandias. However, if you're asked to compare it regarding powerful, unpleasant or significant experiences, it compares well with Storm on the Island, Exposure, London, Kamikaze, Remains and War Photographer. On the next couple of slides, you'll find some tasks. Now, your class teacher might well direct you to complete specific tasks, or if not, you may wish to complete some of those independently. So with this task, I'd like you to find quotations from the poem that link to the power of nature, fear and loneliness, confidence and reflection. And then once you've done that, explain the effect of those on the reader. And finally, this task is to encourage you to start making links between your poems. So I'd like you to think about all the ones that you've studied so far from the Power and Conflict anthology and consider which one you think fits best with the Prelude. Once you've chosen your poem, I'd like you to draw a big Venn diagram and consider the similarities and the differences between these two poems.